Good morning, everyone. My name is Kenneth Grubb. I'm an instructor of history at Wharton County Junior College and the department chair for history and geography at the same college there. I feel a little out of place because I'm actually discussing the battles of Galveston, the two battles of Galveston, and this is, of course, on the cusp in Houston. So let me briefly give you a little background on Galveston, not quite as boisterously as Dr. Weller provided us with Houston, but Galveston is, at this point, one of the largest cities in Houston. It has a population of around 7,200 people. It has roughly 1,200 of those are enslaved peoples. It has by far the most important port city in Texas. About 3/4 of our cotton exports will leave from Galveston. Most of our imports, most of our exports will leave through Galveston. So it is by far the most important port city. If you look at it right before the Civil War, as it leads up to the Civil War, you're looking at a town that is mixed on the idea of secession, at least until, of course, like the rest of the South, with the election of Abraham Lincoln, that changes very, very rapidly, and Galveston comes on board. When they have the election in February of 1861 to decide secession, it is overwhelmingly approved in Galveston. So Galveston, of course, joins with the rest of the state to become part of the Confederacy. By July of that year, it is already being blockaded by the U.S. Navy as part of their blockade of the South. So it is surrounded by July of that year, with the intent, of course, for them to eventually invade the island and take the island and close down that port. And result, once it becomes blockaded, the Confederate forces realize that Galveston is essentially indefensible. So they're going to pull out most of the troops and bring them back onto the mainland, bring them back into places like Houston. So there's my tie to the conference, right? Most of the people from Galveston, most of the troops there are going to be. And they're going to leave a token force under Joseph Cook, who is going to be there to essentially secure Galveston or keep it from falling to the Union. Eventually, there will be an attack by the Union. That attack will come in October of 1862, so over a year after the initial blockade. The attack starts. It depends on how you label the attack. And what happens is, commander of U.S. forces, William Renshaw, sends in the Harriet Lane into Galveston Harbor, and the idea of negotiating a surrender for Galveston. He says essentially what he wants is an unconditional and immediate surrender of the island to Union forces. Unfortunately, they never have this conversation, or they don't have it right away, because the Confederacy, under Cook, decides they don't even want to deal with him. So they refuse to even come out to visit with him on his ship. He then takes his ships. He says, fine, that's great. He pulls the Harriet Lane out. He sends in 4 gunboats and a mortar barge and says, we'll just go ahead and launch our assault. When the Confederates see this, they immediately begin firing from Fort Point, which is on the northeast end of the island, essentially where the ferry landing would be today, right? They begin firing on the Union troops, on the U.S. Navy. The Navy, of course, outguns them, outmans them. They begin returning fire. They destroy the gun at Fort Point. They drop artillery on multiple points around Galveston, and Cook at that point realizes, maybe I should go talk to these folks real quick, right? So he sends out people. They go and talk, and he meets with Renshaw. Renshaw says, I want an unconditional, immediate surrender. Cook absolutely says, no way, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to do that. I refuse. Renshaw says, if you refuse, I will continue to shell this city. I will continue to do that. Cook responds by saying, if you do that, you're going to kill men, women, and children who are innocents, who are people who are not involved in this conflict, especially in particular, always playing on the women and children aspect of this. Cook leaves. Renshaw begins to move his troops in. He begins to move his ships in position for the artillery barrage on Galveston. And a major under Cook actually goes back out and begins to negotiate and says, look, give me some time. Give me a chance to talk to Cook. Give me a chance to get him to surrender. More importantly, give us a chance to allow the women and children to evacuate. And they agree on a 4-day truce. He says, you have 4 days to evacuate the innocents from the island, and if you don't do that, I will then attack the island. What he doesn't realize is that the Confederates are, in fact, going to remove the innocents. They're also going to remove the remaining soldiers, the weapons, the guns, the supplies, everything else they have. Ironically, Renshaw knows this is happening and feels like it's against what they had agreed to do, but since there was never a written document, there were no stipulations written down, no one had ever signed it, he didn't feel as though he had the moral or legal high ground to say, you can't remove the soldiers, you can only remove the innocents. Plus, from a military standpoint, you're looking at a man thinking, if they remove everyone, I have a bloodless takeover. I can actually take my target without a single man lost, which is always preferable, regardless of who you are. So the initial fall of Galveston on October 4th, 1862, or 4 days later, October 8th, 1862, is bloodless. We don't lose a single person. The Union just moves in and takes it over. Ironically, they move into the harbor and take the harbor over. They don't actually take the city over for another month and a half because they don't have ground troops to move into the city. Those guys won't actually show up until December. Unfortunately for them, as they're taking their claim, as they're taking Galveston or the island as they see it, the new commander of Confederate forces in the area, a guy by the name of Major General John Bankhead Magruder, has already devised a plan for retaking back Galveston. And he is going to unleash that plan on New Year's Day, 1863. He has a two-phase plan. He's going to take infantry units and dismounted cavalry and run them across the railroad bridge. You've been to Galveston. You've seen the railroad bridge that connects Galveston to the mainland. He's going to send these guys under cover of darkness, middle of the night. He's going to send them across the railroad bridge to attack the entrenched Union troops who are mostly barricading themselves along the piers. As they begin to attack these troops, the U.S. Navy, who is in the harbor, sees this, moves in to provide support fire for them. What they don't realize is behind them, there are going to be two what we call cotton clads. They're actually just steamships that have cotton bales piled up all around the edges to protect them from fire from the enemy ships. And they're going to sneak in behind the U.S. Navy. One of these ships, the Neptune, will be sunk as it's trying to take the Harriet Lane. But the other, the CS Bayou City, will actually take the Harriet Lane away from the U.S. Navy. While all this confusion is happening, the flagship of the invasion, the Westfield, the one on which Renshaw is guiding all actions, actually runs aground. When it runs aground, the U.S. troops realize that this means it can fall into the hands of the Confederacy. They don't want that to happen. So what they begin to do is rig the ship to explode. They hope that they can leave enough explosives, they can get their men off the ship, and then the ship itself will blow up and they will be able to escape and not leave a weapon in the hands of the Confederacy. Unfortunately for them, that explosion happens before they plan for it to happen, and they're going to lose several U.S. sailors are going to lose their lives. The commander of the ship, and unfortunately Renshaw himself, will die in that explosion. So ultimately, with all of this confusion going on, the Westfield exploding, the dock under fire, the Navy doing this, the people on the ground troops, the U.S. ground troops, begin to believe that the Navy is going to surrender. So they begin surrendering to the Confederate troops, even though they have technically a tactical advantage over the Confederate troops. The Navy themselves realizes they actually are confused by what's going on, and they turn to leave. So as they turn to leave, they actually leave those troops that are on the ground stranded by themselves. So as they run away, those troops then say, okay, well, they're obviously leaving, let's surrender the island. So the island falls to the Confederacy very, very quickly, with the loss of roughly 26 men on the Confederate side, about 120 more wounded. On the Union side, you're looking at the death of about 150 U.S. sailors, with 400 ground troops captured, and the loss of those two ships. So Galveston falls back to the Confederacy, where it will remain for the rest of the war. It will remain in the hands of the Confederacy. That's not the end of the story for Galveston, though, because Galveston, even though it falls back to the Confederacy, is still going to be blockaded by Union troops or Union Navy. And what we're going to see is life in Galveston get very, very difficult over the next 2.5 years until the end of the war. In fact, you're going to see widespread food shortages, fuel shortages, medicine shortages, all of the commodities we need for life. When we have these shortages, you're naturally going to see massive inflation. You're going to see a pound of flour selling for over $2. If you do the shopping at your house like I do, you can get a 5-pound bag of flour at Walmart for $3 today. So 150 years ago, a pound of flour for $2 is an incredible amount of money. A dozen eggs sells for $6. Coffee is as much as $20 a pound. So we see these major shortages and this massive inflation. In addition to that, as was mentioned a minute ago, yellow fever frequently sweeps through, and we're going to see other diseases. You're going to see over 100 civilians and soldiers that are going to die from various epidemics that are going to be in Galveston. As a result of this, you're going to see not only high prices, you're going to see not only commodity shortages, what is available will be subpar at best. In fact, there's one story about a regiment of Confederate troops who gets their beef rations, and they're so inedible that rather than eat them, they march them through town, give them a full military burial, and fire a 21-gun salute to say, this is what this deserves. It doesn't deserve to be eaten. As a result, you see this sort of trouble, you see this sort of pain and suffering of the people, and you're going to see unrest, you're going to see civil unrest, you're going to see desertions from the Confederate Army to a point where the Confederacy itself is going to actually have to lock down Galveston and declare martial law to try to bring things back under control. Ultimately, as we all know, Galveston will be reoccupied by the Union. It just won't happen until June of 1865, after the war itself has actually come to an end. June 18th, 1865, the Union moves into Galveston. June 19th, 1865. The steps of Ashton Villa on the balcony. They're going to read the verbiage of the Emancipation Proclamation, letting the slaves know they're free, or actually telling them they've been free for 2.5 years. Just no one bothered to tell them that, right? So they're going to let them know this, and this, of course, has become it started off as a Texas holiday, Juneteenth, as we call it here, but it has become not just a Texas holiday. It's become a national holiday, an international holiday. Juneteenth, Freedom Day, Emancipation Day. There's going to be a wonderful panel later about Juneteenth, so I won't belabor that point. The irony with the Battle of Galveston, though, is that Juneteenth almost never happened. Because the truth of the matter is that January 1st, 1863 is when the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. The Emancipation Proclamation frees the slaves in territories controlled by the South. In territories in the South that are controlled by the North, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't apply. Had Galveston not fallen back to the Confederates on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation would not have applied to Galveston. They would have actually had to wait till December 6th, 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified, to get their freedom. So this wonderful holiday, this holiday that has become representative of, this paradigm-shifting watershed moment of freeing the slaves, almost never happened had it not fallen to the Confederates on January 1st. Had it fallen on, had it not fallen, had it lasted through the war, had they maintained occupation, that incident that has become so ubiquitous with the telling of the Civil War would have never actually happened in Galveston, which is one of those great ironies. So, while the Battle of Galveston may not hold the same place in the world as Gettysburg or Shiloh or Vicksburg, and rightfully so, I would argue that it is incredibly important in the way we remember the war, because we remember the outcome of the war, we remember the results of the war, and had it not been for them taking it back on January 1st, Juneteenth, as we understand it, would have never happened. So we wouldn't have that moment to rally around, to celebrate this sort of watershed event. Does that make sense? Awesome. I tried to make it as quick as I could because I know we're running behind and I know you guys don't want to lose any of your break while you're doing that. So I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope you have a great conference. Thank you.
My name's Brady Hutchison. I teach at Alvin Community College. I also teach for Wharton County Junior College, which makes Ken my boss. So I have to say that was the best presentation I've ever heard. I think standing ovation might be in order. I don't know. But what I'm going to talk about today is the Battle of Sabine Pass, which does kind of tie in with what Kim was talking about. I grew up in Port Arthur, Texas, literally probably about 3 miles my front porch was from where the battle took place. And if any of you have been to Port Arthur, I apologize first, but it's interesting thing about growing up there is it seems like most people just lump that in with Louisiana. You get that close to the Sabine River, and they just consider, well, it's part of the next state over. We had a state representative that we elected to go to Austin back in the 80s, And he used to joke that he spent 6 months in Baton Rouge before he realized he was in the wrong capital. So with the Battle of Sabine Pass, you know, you have, it gets included some when you talk about Texas history and also gets left out some. In 1985, I was in 3rd grade, and I was already interested in Civil War history. The school told us that they were going to take us to see a Civil War battlefield, and they didn't tell us which one. So, you know, 8 years old, I was thinking, oh, they're going to take us to, you know, Gettysburg or, you know, Shiloh maybe, Vicksburg. They loaded us in a bus and took us to Sabine Pass, and I have to say I was a little disappointed, but now, luckily I didn't hold that against Sabine Pass, because it is kind of significant for not just Texas history, but perhaps even more importantly, it's an important part of the story of Irish immigration into Houston during the time of the war. Dr. Weller mentioned Dowling earlier, and I'll say this briefly before I start about the battle, but he did have his saloon, Bank of Bacchus, which was a few blocks north of where the current criminal courthouse is downtown. He also had his own special house cocktail. Now, if you know, you go to bars, sometimes they'll have their own special house blend. It was called Kiss Me Quick and Go. I don't know what it was, what the recipe for it was. History has lost that. That'd be a good research project for somebody. Eddie, I'll let you, delegate it. But it is interesting even then that they had their own special house blends. And when the war started, Dowling, of course, joins the Confederate Army, along with recruiting some dock workers, really mostly Irish dock workers working here in Houston. And they'll come to be known eventually as Company F, the 1st Texas Heavy Artillery. They'll have a few other names. Davis Guards is also kind of their nickname. The men called themselves the Davies, or sometimes just the Guards, kind of implying that there's only one, I guess, like Ohio State, the Ohio State University, maybe it's something like that. But when the war starts, obviously Texas it knows it's going to be involved to some extent, and the northern government also recognizes the importance of the Texas coast. You see, after New Orleans falls, they start working further westward, and you'll have a plan eventually to capture Galveston. But Sabine Pass was actually 2 different battles. There was the first battle of Sabine Pass and a second battle of Sabine Pass. The battle that everyone that knows about the Sabine Pass remembers is the second one. The first one actually took place literally just days before the Battle of Galveston. The Confederates had built a small fort down at the mouth of the pass, knowing that you're going to have to hold that area because it is an easy spot for blockade runners to slip in and out of. So in late September of 1862, the U.S. Navy put together a small expedition of just a few ships that were supposed to cross over the bar into Sabine Pass, neutralize the fort, and capture the town. At the time, there was no Port Arthur. The town was Sabine City. It wouldn't actually come to be known as Sabine Pass until later. So now it's kind of confusing. You're talking about the Sabine Pass, which is incorporated into Port Arthur, or you're talking about the actual pass. But back then, it was Sabine City, and then the pass. There was a railroad that ran from Houston all the way to Sabine Pass or into Beaumont and terminated there. And Sabine Pass would become an extremely important port even early on in the war. As the Northern Navy starts to perfect their blockading, the Confederates are looking for easier spots to slip in and out where heavy ocean-going warships can't follow them. Sabine Pass is one of those places. And if there's anyone who is one of the true geniuses of the Northern victory in the war, someone who I think doesn't get enough credit, is Gideon Welles, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy. Lincoln unilaterally orders a blockade order. We're talking thousands of miles of coastline, and lands on Gideon Welles' desk, and he says, I'm supposed to do this with, 8 ships, most of which are on foreign station. And he managed to put together a blockade that became very effective and more effective as the war went on. So the Confederates were always looking for ways around that, and that's what made Sabine Pass important. After Galveston fell, a Confederate officer here in Houston said that Sabine Pass was the most important port in the Confederacy. Now, he may have been exaggerating just a little, but it was certainly important here in Texas. So in late September of 1862, a small federal force, naval force, assembles off the pass. There is a heavier warship, the USS Kensington. The captain realizes he can't cross the bar into Sabine Pass because at high tide it's fine, but at low tide he's not going to be able to get back out. So instead he transfers his command over to 2 smaller schooners, the Rachel Seaman and the Henry James. And they will sail into over the bar. They're actually little kind of mortar boats, converted schooners into mortar boats. They cross over and start shelling the fort. There's a very small group of Confederate soldiers there, about 28 artillerymen and 30 dismounted cavalrymen. They have like 2 cannons, and the fort itself is not at the site where the fort would be for the later battle. It's further down, closer to the Gulf side. But they can't shoot back because the naval vessels are too far away, so they simply hug the ground, wait for nightfall, and once the sun goes down and they can move safely, they spike their cannons, bury 2 of them, and withdraw. And they don't just withdraw back into Sabine City, which is about 3 miles up. They withdraw like permanently to Beaumont. They say, we're done, this Confederate thing's not working out, we're leaving. The following morning, the Union commander pulls a little closer to the fort, doesn't get a response from the Confederates, so he lands a small party there of sailors and Marines, and they start making their way on foot the 3 miles up to Sabine City. They're met about halfway there by a delegation from the town, and they come out and formally surrender Sabine City to the U.S. Navy. This happened just a few days before the Battle of Galveston, which means that technically Sabine City was captured before Galveston was. However, after spending a couple of days there, really about 6 or 7 days, they managed to capture 2 British blockade runners who crossed the bar into Sabine Pass without realizing that it had been captured by the U.S. Navy. But this is literally just days before Galveston. There's more important things happening further down the coast. There's also rumors that a very large Confederate force is heading towards Sabine City to retake it. Where they would have come from, I don't know. But the important thing is the U.S. commander believes it. He believes that there's a force of 10,000 Confederates headed his way. And so they get back on their ships and leave. The Sabine City gets to unsurrender itself, at least well, till the end of the war, really. So once Galveston falls and then is recaptured, Lincoln and Halleck are desperate to acquire another port along the Texas coast. They're discussing in Washington, D.C., recapturing Galveston or possibly Indianola, further down the coast. It kind of gets kicked around, different ideas of what to do. The reasoning is because, Lincoln, first of all, the North needs a port, a southern port, to be able to get cotton out of the South. Remember, the North is making all these uniforms for their army. They're not doing that with British cotton. They're doing that with Southern cotton, which means that they do need ports in which they can load up cotton in the South and take it up to New England where their manufacturing is. He's also, losing Galveston was kind of capturing it was great, losing it is kind of a slap in the face, if you will. And plus, Lincoln does know that there is some support for the North, meaning anti-Confederate sentiment in Texas. And perhaps if you can put a large enough force ashore in Texas, some of those people who are not necessarily pro-Confederate will flock over to your side. And you'll also have the people who support whichever side is winning, at that point. If you got 10,000, U.S. troops show up in Houston, and those people in Houston that really don't care about the war one way or the other, suddenly they're going to be the biggest Unionist you can find. So he also knows that. Ultimately, the actual decision, the tactical decision, was left up to General Banks in Louisiana as to what he wanted to do. He decides that landing a force at Sabine Pass, again, another attempt at Sabine Pass, would be the way to go. And I remember as a kid, I'm standing there at Sabine Pass the first time I actually visited there, I'm thinking, why in the heck would anybody want to take this place? They would be doing the Confederacy a favor if they had Sabine Pass. We get back to them now, but the truth is Sabine Pass wasn't the objective. Sabine Pass was the route to get to the objective. Banks's plan was to put initially 5,000 troops ashore at Sabine Pass, move them up to Beaumont, follow the railroad to Houston. Once you get to Houston, you've just isolated Galveston from the mainland. He could then capture Galveston whenever he felt like it, and he could neutralize it completely as a port. Banks actually thought that he could have as many as 15,000 troops in Houston within 2 weeks of taking Sabine Pass. That's kind of a tall order, but it's certainly possible, particularly if they captured the railroad. You could then follow the railroad out of Houston, kind of up 290, where in Hempstead you had a Confederate training camp. They also had a munitions depot, and that's another railhead there. So it was a fairly ambitious plan, but it wasn't one that was necessarily doomed to failure either. The problem that Banks's expedition would run into is that the Confederates had realized a couple of things in Sabine Pass. First of all, their first fort was way too close to the Gulf. So they destroyed it and moved up about 1.5 miles closer to the town. What this did was allowed them to have a fort that was safe from being shelled by warships out in the Gulf, meaning to attack the fort, you'd have to come pretty close. And right there where the fort was, the Sabine River divides into 2 channels, a Louisiana channel and a Texas channel. By putting the fort where they did, it allowed their guns to command the Texas channel completely. They could also elevate and hit the Louisiana channel if need be. So it's kind of funneling any warships closer to them, forcing them to come up under their guns. The guy who actually designed the Confederate fort was Polish. He was a Polish engineer in the Confederate Army, which is kind of interesting because it's going to be a multinational force of Confederates defending it as well. So with this new fort being constructed, it ends up being manned by the Davis Guards. They are all veterans of the Battle of Galveston. In fact, they had about 4 soldiers injured at the Battle of Galveston, 1 fatally. However, a couple of days later, they're in Houston, as it was said in the newspapers, kicking up a ruckus, and it also cost them 4 casualties when they imbibed too much of the, I guess, kiss me quick and go cocktail and started firing off their weapons downtown. So they actually were more dangerous to themselves than the enemy was. But they get stationed there in Sabine Pass, and they had actually felt early on, given how slow the Confederate Army was to actually give them an official designation, they thought that they were being discriminated against based on their Irish Catholic background. Many of them, like Dowling, had come in through New Orleans. That's where my family came in about a year after Dowling's did, also from Ireland. Some of them had come in through Galveston, but they're all Irish Catholics. And given the time period, there was a lot of discrimination against Irish Catholics. Not as bad in the South, but that's their excuse anyway. So the morning of the attack, September 8th, you have a force of a few gunboats and a whole lot of transports assemble off the pass, about 5,000 men. You'll often hear that 40 Irishmen turned back a 5,000-man invasion force. That's technically not true. Those 5,000 troops never landed. What they did was take on 4 gunboats instead. The morning of the battle, when they see the ships assembled off the pass, they don't have any ammunition for their cannons. The fort being relatively new, their ammunition is kept back in Sabine City. So they have to send a wagon to get the ammunition. They manage to just get it secured before the bombardment starts. Also, a young lady in town, sit from up on her roof, can see the ships assembling, and she sends some beef for the soldiers to eat before the battle, along with a note that tells them to fight not like men, but like devils. And if need be, she would defend the town herself. Luckily, it didn't come to that. There's also a legend that Dowling assembled his men together and kind of did the Travis at the Alamo thing. You know, do we surrender or do we stay here and fight? The men all elected to fight. I don't know that that's necessarily true. It's a great story, but kind of like Travis at the Alamo, but probably not true. Ultimately, Dowling was told to hold the fort at all hazards, and that's what he elected to do, and the men would have to follow his orders. As the Union gunboats approached, 500 men, infantrymen, were put onto one gunboat that was supposed to kind of hang back, let the others go in, take care of the fort, and then they could land them and march onto Sabine City, kind of the advance guard. But unbeknownst to the naval commanders, because they're in Sabine Pass with nothing to do, Dowling had his men drive stakes into the channel with different colors to denote distance. One of the hardest things about cannons was your first shot may be short, you have to elevate, fire again, and it's a constant adjustment, estimating distance. With these stakes, as a ship passed between the stakes, they knew exactly how far away they were. So their fire was extremely accurate. They put a round through the boiler of the Sachem, which caused the horrendous injuries to the soldiers on deck. Before I was a mild-mannered professor, I was an arson investigator, so I've dealt with a lot of burn injuries. But without getting too graphic, just imagine a human crawfish, and that's what what happens when you put a cannon round through a boiler. But it disables the Sachem. Well, the Sachem's stuck, blocking the Louisiana channel, which causes the Arizona to have to back up because it can't get past it. So they end up just turning around. The Clifton, which is the one that was tasked with coming in closest to the guns at Sabine Pass, now has all the guns turned on it. A lucky shot really takes away its tiller rope, which causes it to start drifting helplessly. The captain will end up running aground. Despite that, they still keep up a pretty good fire on the fort. The Clifton had some sharpshooters also from a New York infantry regiment on board trying to pick off the Confederate gunners, but the Confederates were able to keep up enough of a rate of fire that eventually the Clifton had to surrender. And there was a whole discussion as to, did the Clifton surrender? Did it simply run aground and they decided to abandon ship? Because those kind of things mattered back then, but ultimately it would in fact surrender. Now, the Confederates fired a total of 107 rounds in about 35 minutes. That's the total rate of fire, which comes out to a little under 2 rounds a minute, or 1 round every 2 minutes, which is better than average for heavy artillery at the time. They kept up an extremely high rate of fire. And, but at the end of the day, did the Battle of Sabine Pass, did this unlikely Confederate victory change the war? No, the South still lost. I mean, it's a great victory, but the Confederates still lost. If the North had won, would it somehow have altered the outcome of the war? Well, they won the war anyway. Would it have shortened it? Possibly. And there's all sorts of different ways you can argue it. But ultimately, really the important thing to come out of this is you have an example of 40 men and 6 cannons standing up against what had to have seemed to be insurmountable odds. But I'll leave you not with my words about Sabine Pass, but with the words of Jefferson Davis. Speaking in 1882, he said, "My friends, there are few in this audience who would tell you who commanded the Confederate forces at Sabine Pass. And yet that battle at Sabine Pass was more remarkable than the Battle of Thermopylae, and when it has its poets and orators to celebrate it, will be so esteemed by mankind." Well, Ed Cottam aside, I don't think Sabine Pass has had too many poets and orators to celebrate it. Maybe that's why most people don't know who commanded the Confederate forces at Sabine Pass, or at least all of you do, right? Dick Dowling. So there you go. Thank you.